The pen trembled in her hand. The words on the paper were nothing but swirls and loops she couldn't understand. She was about to sign. Zelda Emerson had one secret she'd hidden her entire life. She couldn't read a single word, and the man sitting across from her knew it. He was counting on it. With one signature, she was about to give away 320 acres of land, her dead uncle's ranch, everything he had built for her, for just $50. Then a stranger's hand closed around her wrist. "I wouldn't sign that if I were you." She didn't know this cowboy. She didn't know why he cared. But when he read that contract out loud, every word was a knife. And she realized she had been 1 second away from losing everything. What happened next will show you that sometimes the person who saves your life becomes the person you can't live without. This story will teach you that your deepest shame can become the doorway to your greatest blessing, and that one moment of kindness can change the entire direction of a life. If you've ever felt alone, vulnerable, or one bad decision away from disaster, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been saved by a stranger? Your likes and shares help more women discover stories that remind them it's never too late for a second chance. Subscribe so you never miss a story that speaks to your heart. The pen felt unsteady in Zelda Emerson's hand as she looked at the heavy paper. The fancy writing on it was just a mess of swirls and loops that made no sense at all. It might as well have been chicken scratch. She blinked, hoping the words would straighten themselves out, but they just seemed to dance and mock her in the dim light of that land office. It was a miserable, hot August afternoon in 1889, right in Muskogee, Oklahoma territory. "Just sign on the dotted line, Miss Emerson," the land agent said, getting a little pushy. He tapped a thick finger on the paper. His breath was a sour mix of whiskey and tobacco, and the look in his eye made her feel a deep unease. "A simple signature is all that's keeping you from taking over your dear uncle's property." Zelda felt her throat go dry. Her Uncle Marcus was the last piece of family she had. When she got the news he had passed 3 weeks back, she spent every last cent she had to travel down to Oklahoma. The message said he left her his ranch, his land, and everything he called his own. This was meant to be a new beginning for her, a real chance at a life she could call her own after so many years sewing in a crowded boarding house, where the walls were paper-thin, and her future looked just as flimsy. She brought the pen down toward the paper, but her hand was shaking. The shame of not knowing how to read burned hot on her cheeks. Her mama passed when Zelda was only 6, and her daddy always said that teaching a girl to read was a waste of time. By the time he was gone, too, when she was 14, it was just too late to learn. She had gotten good at hiding her secret, coming up with little tricks and excuses. She had even memorized the shape of her own name so she could sign things when she had to. But this time, it felt all wrong. Something about how eager the land agent was, the way he kept looking at the door like he was waiting for someone, set off every alarm bell in her head. "Wait," that voice came from right behind her. It was deep and strong, with a touch of a Texas drawl that made that one word sound like both a question and a command. Zelda nearly jumped out of her skin, almost dropping the pen. A large, rough hand gently but firmly closed around her wrist, stopping her from making her mark. She turned her head and found herself looking up into the face of a man who looked like he'd walked right out of one of those adventure books she'd seen other girls reading. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they strained the seams of his dusty brown shirt. His face was tanned and weathered by the sun, with high cheekbones and a square jaw covered by a few days of dark beard. But his eyes were what truly grabbed her. They were a sharp blue-gray, like a stormy sky, and they were looking right at her with a power that stole her breath. "Ma'am, if I were you, I wouldn't sign that," he said, his eyes then moving to the land agent, who had suddenly lost all the color in his face. "Now, hold on here, Quinn," the agent sputtered, jumping up from his chair. "This is a private matter. This is none of your business." "Is that a fact?" the cowboy, Quinn, said. He let go of Zelda's wrist but didn't move an inch away. Instead, his hand shot out and took the document from the desk. You mind if I take a look at what you're asking this nice lady to sign, Webster? I most certainly do mind. Webster tried to grab the paper back, but Quinn was quicker, his hand closing around it first. Zelda's heart was pounding against her ribs as she watched the tall stranger read the page. She saw his jaw tighten, a small muscle twitching right by his ear, and his eyes got dark with an anger he was trying hard to keep in check. "Miss Emerson, would you allow me to read this out loud for you?" he asked. His voice was steady, but it had a hard edge to it, like a storm brewing just off in the distance. A wave of relief and shame washed over her. She just nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and twisted her hands together in her lap. Quinn cleared his throat and started to read, his voice strong and clear enough for everyone else in the office to hear. "I, Zelda Emerson, do hereby state that I have no legal claim to the property once owned by Marcus Emerson. I give up all my rights to the property, which includes the ranch house, the other buildings, all the livestock, and 320 acres of land, in exchange for the total sum of $50. Zelda let out a gasp that echoed in the now dead silent room. $50? But the telegram said I inherited it all. "I sent that telegram," Webster said, his nervousness now replaced by a hot anger. "And it was all perfectly legal. I have a claim on that property. Your uncle owed me a lot of money, a significant amount, and I am just collecting what is rightfully mine." "That is a lie, Webster, and you know it." Quinn's voice dropped low and dangerous. "Marcus Emerson owned that land free and clear. He paid off all his debts 2 years ago. I know because I loaned him some of that money myself, and he paid me back every single cent plus interest." "You can't prove that," Webster sneered. "Actually, I can," Quinn said. He reached into his vest pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. "Marcus gave me a copy of the deed after he paid off that last debt. He was real proud of it. He wanted someone else to have proof that he owned it, just in case something happened to him. It's a funny thing how a man can sometimes see trouble coming." Zelda started to feel dizzy. She reached out for the desk to steady herself, and in an instant, Quinn's hand was on her elbow holding her up. She could feel the warmth and solid strength of his grip right through her sleeve. "Are you trying to say my uncle's death wasn't an accident?" she whispered. Quinn's face softened a little when he looked down at her, but his hand stayed on her arm. "I'm saying your uncle was found after being thrown from his horse, and it looked like an accident. But Marcus Emerson was one of the best horsemen I ever knew. It always struck me as odd that his horse would just bolt like that, especially on land he knew better than his own name." "That's slander!" Webster's face had turned a deep shade of purple. "I'll have the law on you for that, Quinn." "Please do," Quinn said with a cold smile. "Because I would surely love to have Sheriff Morrison take a good long look at this document you just tried to trick this young lady into signing. Fraud is a mighty serious crime in the Oklahoma Territory. Webster, they've hanged men for less." Webster's eyes darted back and forth between Quinn and Zelda, and she saw the exact moment he knew the game was up. He let out a curse, snatched his hat off the desk, and stormed for the door. "This isn't over," he spat, then slammed the door behind him, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Zelda's knees buckled, and she fell into the chair Webster had just left. Her whole body was shaking, and she couldn't seem to draw a full breath. She had been so close to losing it all, to being cheated out of her only hope, all because she couldn't read. The shame, the fear, and the relief came, crashing down on her all at once, and to her complete horror, she felt tears begin to stream down her face. "Easy now," Quinn said gently. He knelt beside her chair, so he was looking right at her. He took out a clean handkerchief from his pocket and held it out to her. "You are safe. He cannot hurt you any more." "I am such a fool," she said between sobs, dabbing at her eyes with the soft cloth. "I almost signed away everything my uncle left for me. I nearly believed that snake." "You are not a fool," Quinn said, his voice firm. "You're a woman all alone in a place you don't know, and you were taken advantage of by a man who makes a living preying on good people. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes him a coward and a criminal." She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw only pure kindness and honesty in those stormy gray eyes. "Why did you help me? You don't even know who I am." Quinn stood up and offered her his hand to help her to her feet. "Your uncle was a friend of mine, a good friend. Whenever he talked about his niece back in St. Louis, his whole face would just light up. He was so proud of you, of how good you were with a needle and thread, and how you made your own way after you lost your parents. He wanted you to have a better life, and he worked himself down to the bone to build something he could leave to you." The tears started again, but this time it was grief for the uncle she hardly got to know, mixed with a deep gratitude for the stranger who had just saved her. "I wish I had come to visit him before he passed. I wish I had a chance to say thank you." "He knew," Quinn promised her. "He kept every single letter you ever sent him. He had them all in a little box right next to his bed." Zelda wiped her eyes and pulled her shoulders back, trying to gather herself. "I do not even know your full name, sir, and yet I feel like I owe you my whole life." "James Quinn," he said, just touching the brim of his dusty hat. "Most folks around here just call me Quinn. I have a ranch about 5 miles west of your uncle's place. I raise cattle mostly and a few horses." "Zelda Emerson," she replied, even though he clearly already knew. "And I want to apologize for being such a mess. It has been a very, very long couple of weeks." "No apology needed, Miss Emerson. I can only imagine how hard it has been." He glanced toward the door where Webster had vanished. "But I reckon we should get you out of this town before Webster decides to get any other bright ideas. Do you have a place you were planning to stay?" "I was going to get a room at the hotel, but I have almost no money left after—" That little bit of truth made her cheeks burn, but she was done with all the pretending. She was just too tired of trying to look like she had it all figured out when she surely did not. A deep line formed between Quinn's brows as he thought. "That hotel is not the place for you. Not while a snake like Webster is still slithering around town. He's got friends here, the kind you do not want to meet in a dark alley. I reckon it would be best if I took you on out to your uncle's ranch this evening. You can settle in there, and I will see to it you have everything you need." Zelda thought on it for a moment. She knew good and well what proper folks would whisper about an unmarried woman riding off with a man she just met. But then again, proper folks had never lifted a finger to help her. She had to trust her gut on this one. For all his hard looks and the quiet storm she saw in him back when he dealt with Webster, James Quinn had gentle hands and kind eyes, and he knew her uncle, and he knew her, most important of all. He had just pulled her out of a terrible bind. "I would be mighty grateful for that, Mr. Quinn," she said. "Thank you." "Just Quinn is fine," he answered, and a small smile changed his whole face, making him look younger than his years. "Let me go fetch your belongings from wherever you left them, and we can get on the road. I would like to make the ranch by sundown." Zelda's only luggage was a small travel bag she had left over at the stagecoach depot. They went and got it without any trouble, though she could not help but notice how Quinn always positioned himself between her and anyone who might be a threat. His hand was always resting near the pistol he wore low on his hip. She had never been around firearms, and her old life had never given her a reason to be, but now she was thankful for the safety it represented. His horse was a beautiful buckskin, a gelding with smart eyes and a steady nature. With an easy show of strength, Quinn lifted her onto the saddle before swinging up right behind her. Zelda had never ridden a horse this way, pressed up against a man's solid chest with his arms circling her to hold the reins. A warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the hot August sun. "You comfortable?" he asked, his voice a low rumble right by her ear. All she could do was nod, not trusting herself to speak. They rode out of Muskogee just as the afternoon sun started to dip low, painting the Oklahoma sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. This land was a whole different world from what Zelda knew back in St. Louis. It was wide open and untamed, with rolling hills blanketed in prairie grass that swayed like an ocean in the breeze. She spotted cattle grazing way off in the distance, and at one point a flock of wild turkeys that scattered as they rode near. Quinn kept the horse at a comfortable walk, and after a little while he started talking. He told her about the land itself, about the Cherokee and Creek people who had called this place home long before any settlers arrived, and about all the changes the territory had seen in the last few years. "Your Uncle Marcus, he came out this way in 1866, right after the war ended," Quinn explained. "He was one of the first to settle this part of the country. Bought his land fair, worked it hard. He and I got to be friends when I showed up in 1875. I was only 18 then, full of myself and thinking I knew all there was to know about ranching. Marcus was the one who taught me what a man really needed to know to make it out here." "How old are you now?" Zelda asked, and then wished she could take the question back. But Quinn did not seem to mind. 32. "I am 24, she replied. "I will be 25 come October." "Your uncle told me you were young, said he wished you had some kin out here, someone to look out for you." Quinn went quiet for a second. "I hope you do not think I'm being too forward, but I gave him my word before he passed. He made me swear that if anything ever happened to him, I would make sure you got what was rightfully yours safe and sound. He made me promise I would watch over you until you got on your feet." A lump formed in Zelda's throat. "He really said that?" "He did. Had me put my hand right on his Bible and everything. Marcus did not put his trust in many folks, but he trusted me." Quinn's voice got a little lower. "I do not take a promise lightly, Miss Emerson. I will see to it that you are safe and that you can build the life you want out here. It does not matter if that means you run this ranch yourself or sell it for a fair price and start fresh somewhere else. Whatever you choose, I will back your play." "I want to stay," Zelda said, the words coming out before she even thought, surprising her with how sure she sounded. "I want to make my uncle proud. I want to build something of my own here." She felt the smile from him more than she saw it. "Well then, that is exactly what you will do." The ranch came into view as they came over a rise, just as the last bit of sun was disappearing. It was a bigger place than Zelda had imagined, with a good-sized house made from cut lumber instead of sod. It had a big barn, a few other buildings, and corrals that looked like they belonged to a real working operation. The land just rolled on forever in every direction, and she could see a creek shining in the last light of the day. "Marcus built most of this place with his own two hands," Quinn said as they rode down the slope toward the house. "He was a proud man, wanted everything done just so. The house has 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and even a little parlor. It is a finer place than most ranches in these parts." As they got closer, Zelda could see that someone had been looking after the place. The corral fences were sturdy. The barn door was hanging straight, and there were even some flowers planted by the porch, though they looked a little thirsty. "Have you been the one keeping it up?" she asked softly. Quinn nodded as he swung down from the horse and then helped her down, his hands resting firmly on her waist. "I could not just let it fall to pieces. Your uncle loved this ranch too much for that. I have been riding over every few days to check on things, make sure no drifters were trying to hole up here, or that Webster had not sent any of his boys to stir up trouble." "I do not know how I can ever repay you for all you have done," Zelda said, looking up at him in the twilight. He was still standing close, his hands still on her waist, and she found she did not want him to move. "I'm not looking for repayment," Quinn said plainly. "I am just trying to honor my friend's memory and keep the promise I made to him." He took a step back then, and Zelda felt a strange little pang of loss when he let go. She gave her head a small shake, trying to get her wits about her. She was being foolish, letting her feelings get the best of her after such a long, hard day. James Quinn was just being a good man because of a promise he made to her uncle. She could not go reading anything more into it than that. Quinn found a key hidden under a loose floorboard on the porch, a hiding spot so simple it made Zelda smile. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open, holding it for her to go inside first. The house smelled dusty and closed up, but even in the faint light, Zelda could tell it was a wonderful place. The main room had a big stone fireplace, furniture that was clearly built by a skilled craftsman, and windows with real glass panes. The kitchen had a cast-iron stove and a hand pump for water right there inside the house, which was a luxury Zelda had never even dreamed of in her old boarding house room. Quinn moved around the house, lighting the oil lamps, and a warm glow slowly pushed back the shadows. "The bedrooms are down this way," he said, leading her down a short hall. "This one was your uncle's room. The other two are a bit smaller, but they're comfortable enough. I will bring your bag in, and then I will go draw some fresh water so you can wash up a bit. There ought to be some food down in the root cellar, mostly canned goods, but it will be enough to make some supper." "You do not have to stay," Zelda told him, even though the idea of being all alone in this big house in the middle of nowhere suddenly felt terrifying. "I am sure you have your own place to get back to." Quinn looked at her for a long moment, and she got the feeling he saw right past her brave front to the scared woman hiding underneath. "I will stay the night. I can sleep out in the barn. Tomorrow, I will ride back to my ranch and send over one of my hands, a good fella named Charlie. He can stay here for a few days if you want, just until you get settled in. He is getting up there in years and would not mind the lighter work." A wave of relief washed over her. "Thank you. I hate feeling like such a coward, but everything is so different here, and after what happened with Webster—" "You are not a coward," Quinn cut in, his voice firm. "You are being smart. This is wild country, Miss Emerson. Until you learn the lay of the land and know who you can trust, you would be a fool to stay out here by yourself." Over the next hour, Quinn turned out to be a surprisingly handy man to have around. He hauled in buckets of water, got a fire going in the big cook stove, and went down into the cellar to bring up jars of vegetables and preserved meat. While Zelda washed the trail dust from her face and hands in her uncle's room, Quinn started to get a meal ready. When she came back out feeling a little more like herself, she saw him slicing up potatoes and onions like he had done it 1,000 times before. "I never figured a cowboy would be so useful in a kitchen," she said with a little smile. Quinn looked up from his work, and she saw a spark of humor in his eyes. "I have been on my own for a good long while, Miss Emerson. A man either learns to cook or he starves. Besides, I worked on enough cattle drives before I got my own spread to know that if you want to eat decent on the trail, you better learn to make more than just burnt beans and coffee that is strong enough to float a horseshoe." Zelda let out a real laugh, and she realized it was the first time she had laughed like that in weeks. She stepped up to help him, and the two of them worked together to fix a simple but hearty meal of fried potatoes and onions with the preserved beef. They ate at the kitchen table as the night turned completely black outside, and Quinn told her more about the area, about which neighbors were good folks and who to keep an eye on, about the little get-together at the church down in town every month and the best spots to get your supplies. "There is something else we ought to talk about," Quinn said after they'd cleaned their plates and Zelda was washing up in a pan of warm water. "And it is about what went on at the land office today." Zelda's hands went still in the soapy water. She had been dreading this talk, but she knew it had to come. "You had some trouble with that contract," Quinn went on, his voice soft but clear. "And seeing the look on your face, I figure it was not just because the writing was sloppy or the light was bad." A hot shame washed over her, but she made herself look him in the eye. "No, I cannot read. I was never taught. My father figured it was not something a girl needed to know." She steeled herself for him to judge her, to feel sorry for her, for that high and mighty look she had seen on so many other faces when they found out her secret. But Quinn just gave a slow nod, looking more thoughtful than anything else. "That has to make things mighty hard," he said, plain and simple. "Yes." The word was so quiet it was almost lost. "I have gotten good at hiding it just to get by, but today—" her voice cracked. "Today it nearly cost me everything I have." Quinn got up and walked over to where she was standing by the wash basin. He took the plate from her hands, set it down, and gently turned her to face him. "Now you listen to me, Zelda Emerson. Not knowing how to read does not make you simple or worthless. It just means you are someone who was denied a chance that should have been yours all along. But that is something we can fix. I am too old to be learning now, she said, even as a little bit of hope started to flutter inside her. That is just foolish talk. I know plenty of grown folks who learn to read. It is tougher than learning as a kid, I will grant you that, but it is not impossible. He paused for a moment. If you are willing, I could teach you myself. Zelda just stared at him. You would do that for me? It would be my honor to do it. Quinn's voice was as honest as the day is long. Your uncle would have wanted it. He told me once that his one big regret was not getting you out here sooner, not giving you the opportunities your father kept from you. Teaching you to read feels like the right way to honor his memory. Tears started to well up in her eyes again. But they were not the same as before. These were tears of thanks and of hope. I just do not know what to say. Say yes, Quinn offered with a little smile. We can get started tomorrow if you would like. I have got some books over at my place, and I know your uncle kept a Bible and a few other books around here somewhere. Yes, Zelda said, her voice coming back stronger. Yes, I want to learn. I want to read the words my uncle wrote in his letters to me. I want to handle my own affairs without being scared. I want to know what stories are hidden in all those books instead of just guessing. Well, then, we have got ourselves a deal. Quinn stuck out his hand, and Zelda took it. She felt the rough calluses on his palm and the solid strength in his grip. But there was something more. A sort of warmth that seemed to run right up her arm and find a home right there in her heart. That night, Zelda lay down in one of the smaller bedrooms. The door was shut tight with a chair wedged under the knob, just like Quinn suggested, though she knew he was standing watch out in the barn. She could not recall the last time she had felt so protected, so hopeful for what was to come. James Quinn was not at all like the rough-and-tumble cowboys she had seen back in Muskogee. He was well-spoken and kind, and he treated her with a kind of respect she hardly ever got from men. She shut her eyes and thought about his promise to teach her, about how gentle his hands were when he helped her down off his horse and the fire in his eyes when he had read that crooked contract out loud and stood up for her. Something was stirring deep inside her chest, something both dangerous and wonderful, but she pushed the feeling down. Quinn was just being kind on account of the promise he made her uncle. She could not let herself think it was anything else. But right as she was drifting off to sleep, her very last thought was of those stormy gray eyes and a smile that could make a hard man's face look so very tender. The next morning came up clear and bright, promising another scorcher of an Oklahoma day. Zelda woke up to the sound of someone moving about in the kitchen. For a second, a wave of panic hit her, but then she remembered where she was and who was with her. She dressed in a hurry, putting on one of her 2 good day dresses and braiding her dark hair, wishing she had a looking glass to check herself. When she came out, she found Quinn standing at the stove frying up eggs and bacon that he must have brought over from his own place. He had shaved and tidied himself up, and in the bright morning light, she got a better look at him. He was handsome in that rugged sort of way, with little scars on his hands that told of a life of hard work, and lines around his eyes that hinted he smiled a lot more than his serious face let on. "Morning," he said as soon as he saw her. "I hope you do not mind me making myself at home in your uncle's kitchen. I figured you would wake up hungry." "I do not mind one bit," Zelda said, walking over to lend a hand. "This is awful kind of you." They ate their breakfast together, and Zelda felt herself starting to relax around him. Quinn had a calm way about him that was easy to be around, and he was perfectly fine with comfortable silence, not feeling like he had to fill up every second with talk. After they ate, Quinn gave her a tour of the property in the daylight. The ranch was even bigger and better than she had thought. The barn held 2 horses that had belonged to her uncle, both of which Quinn had been looking after. There were chickens scratching in a coop, a milk cow grazing in a small pasture, and all the equipment needed to work the land. "Your uncle ran about 50 head of cattle," Quinn explained while they walked. "I moved them over to my property after he passed, mixed them in with my own herd to make it easier to look after them all. Whenever you are ready, we can sort them out and bring them back home. This ranch could handle more, 100 head easy. Maybe even more if you fix up the water situation." "I do not know the first thing about ranching," Zelda confessed. "Back in St. Louis, I sewed dresses and patched up shirts. I can sit a horse, but only a gentle one, and I have never been around cattle. You will learn, Quinn said with confidence, and you do not have to go it alone. You can hire some hands, and I will help you get on your feet. Marcus had some money put away. I know, 'cause he told me so. There ought to be a lockbox somewhere in the house with his cash and important papers. They found the lockbox tucked under a loose floorboard in Marcus's bedroom, right next to a small wooden chest. Inside that box was more money than Zelda had ever laid eyes on in her entire life. Over $800 in gold and silver coins, along with the deed to the ranch, a stack of receipts, and a bundle of letters tied up with a string. "These are my letters," Zelda whispered, knowing the envelopes right away. He truly did keep every single one. "Look here," Quinn said, holding up a different envelope. "This one has your name on it." Zelda reached for it with hands that trembled. Through the thin paper, she could make out the shapes of words, a full letter her uncle had written before he passed on. But the script was like a foreign language to her. She lifted her eyes to Quinn, feeling a mix of helplessness and frustration. He understood without a word. He gently took the letter from her and carefully broke the seal. He smoothed out the pages, and his steady, clear voice filled the quiet room. "My dear Zelda, if you are reading this, it means I have gone on to join your mother and father in whatever lies beyond. I hope my end was quick and that I was not made to suffer. But no matter how it happened, I want you to know I was at peace with my choices. I built this ranch for you, every single board and every last nail. When your father died and I got word of how you were living, working your fingers to the bone in that crowded city, I swore I would build something better for you. I should have brought you here sooner. That is my one true regret. But I wanted to have something worthwhile to offer you first, a place that would give you safety and your own life. The ranch is yours now, with no debts to its name. The land is rich, the water is dependable, and there is plenty of room to grow. I also managed to save a little money, though I know it is not a fortune. My greatest wish is that you will find your happiness here, that you will create a life filled with the joy and freedom that you missed out on as a child. I have already spoken to my friend James Quinn about you. He's a good man, Zelda, one of the best I've ever known. He will help you get your feet on the ground and keep you safe from the buzzards who will try to take advantage of a woman by herself. Trust him. He gave me his solemn promise that he would look after you. And a promise from James Quinn is as solid as a live oak. Live a good life, my dear niece. Be happy. Be free. With all my love, your Uncle Marcus. By the time Quinn had finished reading, tears were tracing paths down Zelda's cheeks. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the true weight of her uncle's devotion and sacrifice. He had spent years of his life building this future for her, and she never had a clue. "He was a good man," Quinn said in a low voice, carefully folding the letter and handing it back. "One of the finest I have known. He talked about you constantly, wondering how you were getting on, if you were well, if you were happy. Whenever he received a letter from you, he would read it again and again. I wish I had known him better," Zelda whispered. "I have just a handful of memories of him from when I was a girl. Only impressions of a kind man with a booming laugh who always brought me peppermints." "He would want you to be happy here," Quinn said. "That is the best possible way to honor his memory. Live the life he wanted for you." Zelda wiped her eyes and squared her shoulders with a nod. "Then that is exactly what I will do. I will learn everything I need to know to make this ranch thrive. I will learn to ride and handle cattle and become the woman my uncle always believed I could be." Quinn smiled at her, and she felt that little flutter inside her chest once more. "I have no doubt you will. Now I need to ride back to my own place and gather some things. I will bring Charlie over like I promised. Will you be all right by yourself for a few hours?" Zelda looked around at the sturdy house, at the land that stretched out in every direction, at the morning sun sparkling on the creek. "I will be fine," she said, and she truly meant it. After Quinn rode off, Zelda spent the morning exploring her new home from top to bottom. She found her uncle's clothes in the bedroom, his small collection of books on a shelf in the parlor, and his tools all arranged neatly in the barn. Everywhere she looked, she saw proof of a man who had lived with intention and care, who had taken great pride in his work and in his land. In the small wooden chest they had discovered with the lockbox, Zelda found something that made her gasp. It was a magnificent quilt, carefully folded and kept safe, made in a pattern of stars and moons. Tucked within its folds was a note in her uncle's handwriting. Quinn had left his reading glasses, so she carefully copied the words onto a spare piece of paper, making a plan to ask him to read it to her later. She was in the kitchen trying to make sense of the cast-iron stove when she heard the sound of horses approaching. For a second, a spike of fear went through her. But then she recognized Quinn's buckskin, and beside him rode an older man on a gentle-looking mare. "Miss Emerson," Quinn called as he swung down from the saddle, "I would like you to meet Charlie Watson. Charlie, this is Zelda Emerson, Marcus's niece." Charlie appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and a weathered face that was full of kindness. He removed his hat and nodded with respect. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Emerson. Marcus was a fine man. I am truly sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Watson," Zelda said, taking an immediate liking to him. "Just Charlie, miss. Mr. Watson was my father, and he has been gone these 20 years. He glanced around the ranch with an approving eye. Marcus kept this place up right nice. I would be honored to stay on for a while if you need help getting settled in." "I would appreciate that very much, Charlie," Zelda said with gratitude. Quinn had brought along some supplies, including a box filled with books and papers. "I thought we could start with the basics this afternoon if you're up to it," he said to Zelda. "Charlie can keep himself occupied around the ranch. That will give us some privacy for the lessons." They sat down at the kitchen table after lunch, and Zelda felt a nervous fluttering in her stomach. She had always been deeply ashamed of her inability to read, and had hidden it for so long that the idea of revealing her ignorance was difficult, even though Quinn already knew her secret. But Quinn was patient and methodical. He started with the alphabet, showing her how to form each letter and having her practice writing them on a slate he had brought with him. His hands guided hers whenever she stumbled, and he praised her whenever she got one right. "You have good penmanship," he said after an hour of practice. "Steady and clear. That will serve you well." "I learned how to sew," Zelda explained. "Fine needlework takes a steady hand and close attention to detail. I suppose that is a help." "It surely is." Quinn showed her how letters came together to form simple words. Cat, hat, bat. "Do you see the pattern? Once you understand how the sounds connect to the letters, reading becomes a lot less of a mystery." They worked for 2 hours straight before Quinn called a halt. "That is enough for today. Learning requires rest just as much as it does practice. Your brain needs time to absorb all the new information." Over the next week, they fell into a routine. Charlie proved to be a godsend, taking care of the daily chores around the ranch with a cheerful attitude and teaching Zelda the practical side of ranch life. He showed her how to milk the cow, how to collect eggs without getting pecked, and how to groom the horses and check their hooves for stones. "You are a natural at this, Miss Zelda," Charlie said one morning as she successfully saddled one of the horses under his watch. "Most city people take months to get comfortable around livestock, but you have taken to it like you were born to it." Meanwhile, Quinn came over every afternoon to continue her reading lessons. They moved on from individual letters to simple words and then to basic sentences. Zelda was frustrated by how slowly she was learning compared to what she imagined children could do. But Quinn remained encouraging. "You are doing remarkably well," he insisted one afternoon when she threw down the slate in frustration. "You're learning adult concepts at the same time you are learning the basics. Give yourself credit for what you have accomplished." "I just want to be able to read my uncle's letter for myself," she said, her voice cracking just a bit. "And any other letters he wrote. I want to be able to read the deed to my property without having to trust somebody else's word. I want to be independent." Quinn reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You will be. I promise you that you will be. But independence does not mean you have to do everything all alone, Zelda. It means having the skills and the knowledge to make your own choices. You are gaining those every single day. The touch of his hand on hers sent a flood of warmth through her whole body. She looked up and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, something powerful and unspoken hung in the air between them. Then Charlie's voice called from outside, which broke the spell, and Quinn pulled his hand back. I should check on something in the barn, he said, his voice sounding a little rough. We can continue the lesson tomorrow. That night, as Zelda lay in bed, she could not stop thinking about that moment, about the feeling of Quinn's hand on hers, and about the look in his eyes. She knew she was in danger of falling for him, this serious cowboy with gentle hands and a kind heart. But she had no idea if he felt anything for her beyond a sense of duty and friendship. The next Sunday, Quinn suggested that Zelda attend the monthly community gathering at the church in Muskogee. It would be good for you to meet the respectable people in the area, he said. Let them know you are Marcus's heir and that you are planning to stay. It will also send a clear message to Webster that you are not going anywhere. Zelda was nervous about going back into town, but she agreed. She wore her best dress, a dark blue calico that she had made herself, and pinned her hair up in a style that she hoped looked respectable rather than plain, fashionable. She had never been stylish and never had the money for it, but she always took pride in how she presented herself. Quinn pulled up in a wagon instead of on horseback, dressed in clean clothes and a vest that made him look almost respectable, though his gun belt was still strapped firmly to his hips. He said, "You look mighty lovely, Mum," when he first saw her, and the kind words brought a warmth to her cheeks. The church was a plain wooden building at the edge of town, and the yard was already crowded with folks when they got there. Zelda felt every single eye turn their way as Quinn helped her down from the wagon. His hands rested on her waist, maybe just a second longer than they needed to. "Stay close now," he whispered. "Some of these people are good folks, but others are bought and paid for by Webster." He took her to meet the minister first, a man with a kind face named Reverend Thompson, who gave her a warm welcome. "Your uncle was a fine man and a real friend to this town. We were all heartbroken to hear of his passing. If there is anything at all my wife and I can do to help you get settled in, you just have to say the word." There were other friendly faces in the crowd, too. A rancher named Mr. Davis and his wife told Zelda to come by and visit them any time she pleased. A widow by the name of Mrs. Patterson offered to bring over a jar of her homemade preserves and swap recipes. A young couple with 3 little children made her feel welcome in the community. But there were also people who eyed her with suspicion or plain old scorn, and she saw Webster standing with a group of rough-looking fellows near the back of the churchyard, watching her with open hostility. "Pay him no mind," Quinn said in a low voice, his hand resting on the small of her back. "He can't cause you any trouble here." During the church service, Zelda sat next to Quinn on one of the hard wooden benches and listened to the Reverend talk about community and looking out for your neighbors. She couldn't read the words in the hymn book, but she remembered many of the old songs from when she was a little girl and sang right from her heart. Beside her, Quinn's deep voice mixed with hers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of belonging that had been missing from her life. After the service, a meal was laid out on long tables in the churchyard. The women of the town had brought all sorts of dishes to share, and even though Zelda had come empty-handed, several of the ladies told her not to worry about it one bit and welcomed her to join them anyway. "We heard about what happened down at the land office with Webster," Mrs. Davis said in a quiet tone as they filled their plates. "That man is a black mark on this town. I am so glad James Quinn was there to help you." Zelda chose her words carefully. "Mr. Quinn has been very generous." The older woman shot her a knowing glance. "James Quinn is one of the finest men in this whole territory, Miss Emerson. Honest, a hard worker, and loyal to the folks he calls friends. If you ask me, he has been on his own for far too long. He needs someone to share that big ranch of his with." Zelda could feel her face getting hot. I am sure I do not know what you are suggesting, Mrs. Davis. The woman just smiled. I have known James since he was 18 years old and greener than fresh spring grass. I have never once seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you. Before Zelda could think of a reply, Quinn was standing right beside her. Are these ladies giving you a hard time, Miss Emerson? He asked, though his eyes were twinkling with good humor. Not at all, Zelda managed to get out. Mrs. Davis was just making me feel welcome. Among other things, Mrs. Davis added with a chuckle, you take good care of this young lady, James. She is good people, just like her uncle was. As they ate their meal, sitting in the grass under the shade of a big oak tree, Webster and two of his cronies walked right up to them. Zelda tensed up immediately, but Quinn stayed perfectly calm, though she saw him shift his body just a little, putting himself between her and the land agent. Miss Emerson, Webster said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. I do hope there are no hard feelings about our little misunderstanding at the land office. I would surely hate for us to be on bad terms. Zelda kept her voice firm, even though her heart was hammering in her chest. There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Webster. You tried to swindle me. If Mr. Quinn had not stepped in, you would have stolen my inheritance clean from under me. Webster's eyes narrowed into slits. That is a mighty serious thing to say. I was simply trying to help you understand the predicament you were in. By lying to her. Quinn's voice was dangerously low. By drawing up a fake document, by trying to cheat her out of 320 acres of land for $50. What would you call that, Webster? I would call it good business, Webster sneered. And I would remind you, Quinn, that you are not her husband, and you are not her father. You have no legal say over Miss Emerson or what she does. No, Quinn agreed. But I am a witness to attempted fraud. And if you ever come near Miss Emerson again with anything but honorable intentions, I will make certain Sheriff Morrison hears every last detail of what happened that day. Webster's face turned a deep shade of red. You think you are so high and mighty, Quinn, but you are just a drifter who got a lucky break. You do not belong here any more than this ignorant city girl does. Quinn moved so fast, Zelda barely even saw it happen. 1 second he was sitting right beside her, and the next he had Webster by the shirt collar, hoisting him nearly off the ground. You will apologize to Miss Emerson, Quinn said, his voice as cold as ice. Right this instant. Webster's friends started to move forward, but several other men from the town, including Mr. Davis and the Reverend, quickly stepped in between them and Quinn. I believe it is time for you to leave, Webster, Reverend Thompson said with authority. This is a house of the Lord, and we will not have any violence or bullying here. Webster yanked himself out of Quinn's grasp and smoothed down his coat. This is not finished, he hissed before storming off, his men trailing right behind him. Quinn sat back down next to Zelda, his jaw set tight. I apologize. I should not have lost my temper like that. Do not you dare apologize for defending me, Zelda said softly. No one has ever done that for me before. The wagon ride back to the ranch was quiet, as both of them were wrapped up in their own thoughts. But when Quinn helped her down, his hands lingered on her waist, and when she looked up into his face, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart start to race. Zelda, he began, then seemed to stop himself. Miss Emerson, I just want you to know that you are not by yourself out here. Whatever you might need, whatever trouble comes looking for you, I will be right here. Why? The question slipped out before she could catch it. Why are you being so kind to me? Is it only because of the promise you made to my uncle? Quinn's hands tightened on her waist just a little. It started out that way, he admitted. But it has grown into something more than that. You are brave and smart and stubborn in the best way. You face down troubles that would break most people, and you just keep on going. You make me want to be a better man, to do more. I have not felt this way about anyone in a very long time. Zelda's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. I do not know what to say, You do not have to say a thing, Quinn said in a gentle voice. I know this is happening fast and you have been through so much already. I just wanted you to know that my feelings for you are more than just an obligation. I care about you, Zelda Emerson. I care a whole lot. Before she had a chance to answer, before she could tell him that she felt the very same way, that she thought about him all the time, that his smile could brighten her entire day, and his absence left a dull ache in her chest, Charlie came out of the barn, and the moment was lost. But as she lay in her bed that night, Zelda played Quinn's words over and over in her mind. He cared for her. It was not just kindness or duty. He felt something real, something that was beginning to match the growing feelings inside her own heart. The reading lessons went on, and Zelda found she was getting better by leaps and bounds now that she was past the first tough parts. Quinn brought her more books, moving her up from simple sentences to whole paragraphs, and he watched with clear pride as she slowly and with a few stumbles read her very first complete page of a book all by herself. I did it, she whispered, looking up at him with her eyes shining. I really read a whole page. You surely did, Quinn agreed, and the warmth in his voice made her feel like she was glowing with happiness. You ought to be mighty proud of yourself. They were sitting close together at the kitchen table, their heads bent over the book, and when Zelda looked up, she realized Quinn's face was just inches away from hers. She could see the tiny specks of darker blue in his gray eyes, could count the small, faded scars on his tan skin, could feel the warmth of his breath. Zelda, he said softly. And then he started to lean in closer, giving her plenty of time to pull back, to say no, to stop what was about to happen. But she did not want to stop it. She wanted this more than she had wanted anything in a very long time. So when his lips met hers, gentle and asking for permission, she kissed him back with all the feeling that had been building up for weeks. The kiss was everything she had ever dreamed of and so much more. It was soft and full of passion and held the promise of things to come. Quinn's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek, and Zelda felt like she was both falling and soaring at the same exact time. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing a little heavily, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. I have been wanting to do that for days, he confessed. I have been wanting you to, Zelda whispered back. I know this is all kinds of complicated, Quinn said. I know you have only been here a few weeks and you are still mourning your uncle and learning how to run a ranch and trying to find your feet, to build a new life. I do not want to rush you or put you on the spot, but I need you to know that I am fallen in love with you, Zelda. I think it started happening the very second I stopped your hand from signing that paper. Tears welled up in Zelda's eyes, but these were happy tears. I am fallen in love with you too, she said. I have been trying to tell myself it was all happening too fast, that I was just grateful for you helping me. But it is more than that. It is so much more. Quinn kissed her again, this time slower, just enjoying the moment. When they finally pulled apart, he took both of her hands into his. I want to court you the right way. I want to take you into town for dinner, to spend time with you that is not just about these lessons. I want every single person to know how important you are to me. I would like that, Zelda said, smiling right through her tears. I would like that very much. In the weeks that followed, the bond between them grew deeper and stronger. Quinn kept up with the reading lessons, but now they were mixed with stolen kisses and long talks about all their hopes and dreams. He told her all about his past, about growing up in Texas after his folks died from a fever, about working as a ranch hand since he was just 14, and about saving up every last penny until he could finally buy his own piece of land. Zelda told him about her own childhood, about her mother passing away and her father's turn to drink, about all the years of scraping by and being poor, and about teaching herself to sew by candlelight and taking in mending just to make ends meet. She told him about the shame she carried for not being able to read, the constant fear of someone finding out, and the deep loneliness of always feeling like an outsider. You do not ever have to be alone again, Quinn promised her, holding her tight on the porch as the sun went down over the Oklahoma prairie. "I will be right here for you, always." Charlie, who had pretty much become a permanent part of the ranch, watched the two of them with a look of clear approval. "About time that boy settled down," he said to Zelda one morning while they were feeding the chickens. "He has been wound too tight for too long. You are good for him, Miss Zelda." You bring the smile back to his face. As the summer started to turn into fall, Zelda's reading got better by leaps and bounds. She could now make her way through most of her uncle's letters, even though the bigger words still gave her some trouble. Quinn brought her a newspaper from town, and she painstakingly worked her way through the articles, determined to understand it all. Zelda's world was finally bigger than just her ranch, but the ranch itself was doing better than ever under her watch. With Charlie's help and Quinn's steady advice, she'd gotten the hang of working cattle, mending fences, and even keeping the account books straight. She brought on two young fellas Mr. Davis recommended, a pair of brothers named Tom and William, who were good workers and knew their manners. Webster hadn't stirred up any more plain-to-see trouble, but Quinn told her to keep a sharp eye out. "He's not the kind to just let something go," Quinn had said. "Losing face like he did when his plan fell through, a man like that will carry a grudge." That October, for her birthday, Quinn took Zelda into Muskogee. He bought her a handsome leather journal and a few pencils. "For your writing practice," he told her, "and for keeping your thoughts. Every rancher ought to keep a journal." Later that evening, back at her place, Quinn asked her to take a walk with him down to the creek. The fall air was crisp but nice, and the first stars were starting to pop out in the twilight. "I've got something to ask you," Quinn said while they stood by the water, his arm resting gently on her shoulders. "And I need you to give it some real thought before you say anything, because it is mighty important." Zelda's heart started to pound. She turned to look at him, and in the dimming light she watched him reach inside his coat pocket. "Zelda Emerson," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I know we've only known one another for 3 months. I know by the way folks do things back east, this is way too fast, too sudden. But life is different out here on the plains. We grab onto our happiness when we find it, and we don't worry too much about doing things by the book. You are the most amazing woman I've ever known. You're brave and good-hearted, and you don't back down. You meet every problem head-on, and you make me want to be a better man. I love you with all my heart, and I want to spend all my days with you. Will you marry me?" He opened his hand, and Zelda saw a simple gold ring with a small, beautiful blue sapphire stone. "It was my mother's," Quinn said softly. "About the only valuable thing she ever had. I've held on to it all this time, waiting for the right woman. You're that woman, Zelda. You are my future, my home, and my whole heart." Zelda's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, James Quinn, I will marry you. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. You've given me everything I never even knew I was missing. A home, a future, hope, and love. Just so much love." Quinn slid the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit, like it was made just for her. Then he kissed her, and Zelda knew deep in her soul she was right where she was supposed to be. They got married a month later in November of 1889 in the very same church where they'd gone to that first town meeting. Reverend Thompson led the service, and it felt like half the territory showed up to see them hitched. Mrs. Davis shed a few happy tears. Charlie stood right up there as Quinn's best man, looking proud as could be in his Sunday best. Even the new boys from Zelda's ranch came, smiling from one ear to the other. You could tell Webster was missing, and Sheriff Morrison made sure everyone saw him there. A quiet message that the law was keeping an eye on things and wouldn't stand for any trouble. Zelda wore a new dress she had made, a pale gray silk with fine stitching around the collar and sleeves. Quinn was in a black suit that made him look a little unfamiliar, right up until she saw his eyes, warm and full of love, looking only at her. When the Reverend said they were man and wife, Quinn kissed her right there in front of God and everybody. And Zelda didn't mind one bit about being proper or turning red. She was Mrs. James Quinn now, and she'd never felt a joy like this before. They spent their first night as husband and wife at Quinn's ranch. which was a bigger and more settled place than her uncle's. The house was sturdy and cozy, and the main bedroom had clearly been fixed up with a lot of thought. The bed had clean, fresh sheets, a vase of wildflowers sat on the dresser, and a warm fire was snapping in the fireplace. "I want you to feel like this is your place," Quinn said, showing her around. "It's as much your home now as it is mine. If you want to change a single thing or move furniture around, you just tell me." "It's perfect," Zelda promised him, taking his hand in hers. "You're perfect." Their first night together was gentle and full of feeling more than Zelda had ever dreamed of. Quinn was patient and kind with her, showing her nothing but love. When the morning sun started to peek through the curtains, Zelda felt like she finally understood what it meant for two people to become one. In the following days, they started to figure out the day-to-day business of their new life. They agreed to keep both ranches going. Charlie and the two new boys would keep managing Zelda's property, while they made their main home at Quinn's. Putting the two properties together made them one of the bigger outfits in the territory, and they knew with some smart planning they could build something that would last. Zelda kept up with her reading lessons, but these days they usually ended with a lot of laughing and kissing. By Christmas time, she could read nearly anything she put her eyes on, even if some of the fancier words still gave her a little trouble. Quinn gave her a beautiful leather-bound Bible with her name pressed in gold on the cover, and she would spend hours reading chapters out loud to him. "I am just so proud of you," he said to her one snowy night as they sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. "You have done so much in just a few months. Your uncle would be astonished." "I couldn't have done any of it without you," Zelda replied, looking up to kiss him. "You gave me the nerve to even try to think that I could learn." "That nerve was in you the whole time," Quinn said. "I just helped you find it." The winter of 1889 to 1890 was a rough one, with deep snows and a biting cold, but Zelda had never been happier. She and Quinn worked right alongside each other, tending to the animals and mending equipment and making plans for the spring. At night, they would talk for hours, sharing old stories and future dreams, and building a trust between them that was deeper than just a husband and wife. Then in March, Webster made one last try to stir up trouble. He went and filed a claim in the territorial court, saying that Marcus Emerson had owed him money and that the debt ought to be paid out of the ranch. Quinn and Zelda rode to the courthouse armed with all of Marcus's neatly kept books and records, which had receipts proving every last penny had been paid. The judge was a serious-looking man named Harrison, and he went over every single paper. Then he peered down at Webster with a look of pure disgust. "Mr. Webster, this claim of yours isn't just empty, it's close to being a lie. Mr. Emerson's books are perfectly in order, and they prove he didn't owe you a dime when he passed. What they do show is that you tried to bill him for more than you were owed a few times, and he had to argue with you about it. I am throwing this claim out, and I'm telling you now, any more pestering of Mrs. Quinn or any other schemes to cheat her will land you in court with criminal charges. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Webster left that courthouse a beaten man, and nobody heard a peep from him after that. Word got around that he packed up and cleared out of the territory a few months later, too ashamed to show his face. When spring rolled in, it breathed new life into the ranches. The cows dropped healthy calves, the mares had their foals, and Zelda put in a garden near the house, planting vegetables and flowers. She discovered she had a real love for it, for the feeling of the good earth under her nails, and the pure satisfaction of watching things sprout and grow. Then in May, she figured out she was pregnant. That realization brought a wave of both pure joy and sheer terror. She waited until after supper one evening to tell Quinn, her eyes glued to his face, worried about what he might think. His happy holler could have been heard clear in the next county. He scooped her up and spun her around. Then, just as quick, he set her down ever so gently, like she might shatter. "Are you certain? Are you feeling all right? Do you need me to fetch a doctor?" Zelda just had to laugh at how nervous he got all of a sudden. "I am positive, and I feel just wonderful. Mrs. Patterson said as much when I rode over to visit her yesterday. She has had 6 children of her own, so she certainly knows all the signs." "We are going to have a baby," Quinn said, his voice full of wonder as he laid a hand on her stomach, which was still flat. "Our own baby? Are you happy about it?" Zelda asked, even though she could already see the answer shining in his eyes. "Happy is not a big enough word for this," Quinn said, pulling her into a hug. "You have given me everything I could ever want, Zelda. A real home, a reason for being, love, and now a family. I reckon I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy went along without a hitch, and Zelda kept right on working around the ranch, no matter how much Quinn worried. "I am pregnant, not made of delicate glass," she would tell him any time he tried to keep her from doing a chore she felt was perfectly fine to do. Mrs. Davis and a few of the other women from the community made it a point to come by and visit, bringing little baby clothes, good advice, and plenty of support. Zelda had never really had a circle of women friends before, and she came to cherish those friendships. "You have become a true part of this place," Mrs. Davis told her one afternoon while they sat on the porch shelling peas. "Folks here respect you and James. They see the hard work you both put in and how fair you treat your hired hands and how you're always there to help a neighbor. Y'all are exactly the kind of folks we need to build up this territory." In December of 1890, just a little over a year after Zelda had first set foot in Oklahoma, she gave birth to a strong, healthy baby boy. The labor was long and hard. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Davis stayed by her side, while Quinn wore a path in the floor of the next room from all his anxious pacing. But the moment he heard his son's first cry, he came bursting into the bedroom with tears just streaming down his face. "He is just perfect," Quinn whispered, looking down at the tiny red-faced baby nestled in Zelda's arms. "Completely and utterly perfect." They named him Marcus James Quinn, after her uncle and his own father. They called him Little Mark, and he had his daddy's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. From that very first day, he became the center of their whole world. Zelda found that being a mother was a challenge, but it was also deeply satisfying. She had never been around babies before and had no one to show her how it was done. But she learned as she went, with Quinn's steady support and the wisdom from the more seasoned mothers in the community. The ranches kept on doing well. By the time Mark was a year old, they had grown their cattle operation by a good measure and had to hire on more help. Quinn showed Zelda how to handle the business end of ranching, how to bargain for the best prices and keep the books straight, and she found out she had a natural talent for numbers that surprised them both. In the autumn of 1892, Zelda gave birth to their second child, a little girl they named Caroline Rose. She had her father's stormy gray eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, and she kept them on their toes from the moment she drew her first breath. Life settled into a pleasant and steady rhythm. The children grew bigger, the ranches prospered, and Zelda's reading got so good that she was teaching Mark his letters before he was even 4 years old. She started keeping detailed journals about their lives, writing down everything from what the cattle sold for to Caroline's first words, making a history for their children to have one day. Quinn was just as good a father as he was a husband. Zelda would often find him out in the barn with Mark, teaching the boy all about horses and cattle, or out in the garden with Caroline, helping her pick the vegetables. He was patient and kind and firm when he had to be, but always full of love, and watching him with their children made Zelda fall in love with him a little bit more every single day. In 1896, when Mark was 6 and Caroline was 4, Zelda found out she was pregnant again. This time around was harder than the first two, and Quinn put his foot down about her taking it easy. She finally agreed, though she did not much like it, and spent more time telling others what to do than doing the heavy work herself. She found she did not mind it as much as she thought she would. Their third child, another son they named Daniel Thomas, was born in the early part of 1897. He was the biggest baby of the three with a powerful set of lungs, and his father's own stubbornness. Zelda often joked that he was going to be a handful, and she turned out to be absolutely right. By the time the new century came around, the Quinns were known as one of the most successful ranching families in the whole territory. They had made it through droughts and tough winters, unpredictable market prices, and even a few cattle sicknesses, but they had always pulled through because of their hard work and smart planning. In November of 1907, Oklahoma officially became a state, and Quinn and Zelda took their 3 children to Muskogee to see the big celebration. Mark was 17 by then, tall and strong just like his father, and learning the family business, getting ready to take over one of the ranches himself someday. Caroline was 15, smart as a whip and full of grit, already talking about wanting to be a teacher. Daniel, at 10 years old, was the wildest of the bunch, always finding some new kind of adventure to get into. "Can you even believe how far we have come?" Quinn asked Zelda that night, as they stood watching the fireworks with his arm wrapped around her waist. "From that first day in the land office all the way to this. Sometimes it all feels like a dream. If this is a dream, then I hope I never wake up," Zelda said, leaning her head against his shoulder. She thought back to that scared young woman who had stood in that land office 18 years ago, who could not even read the paper she was about to sign, and she was amazed at how much her life had changed. She had learned to read and write. She had become a successful rancher. She had raised 3 wonderful children, and she had built a life better than anything she could have ever dared to imagine. "I love you," Quinn said, just as he had said more times than she could count over the years. But those words never once lost their meaning. "I love you too," Zelda replied, "with every part of me." The years kept rolling by, and they brought their share of both happiness and sadness. Charlie Watson passed on in his sleep in 1909 at the ripe old age of 78. They buried him on a hill that looked out over both of their ranches with a simple stone that said, "A faithful friend and a true cowboy." The whole family missed him something fierce, because he had been like a grandfather to the children. Mark married a sweet girl from town named Sarah in 1910, and they took over running what used to be Zelda's uncle's ranch. They gave Quinn and Zelda their very first grandchild, a little girl named Zelda Marie, in 1911, and the great circle of life kept turning. Caroline did become a teacher, and she opened up a school in Muskogee that taught children from all around. She married a doctor named Michael Harris in 1914, and they had 2 sons of their own. Caroline made sure that every single child who walked into her school learned how to read no matter where they came from, because she never forgot her own mother's struggles. Daniel, living up to his wild spirit, worked for a few years as a deputy sheriff before he finally settled down to help his brother run the ranch. He married late, at 30 years old, to a widow who had 3 children, and he turned out to be a wonderful stepfather. Through all of it, Quinn and Zelda's devotion to each other never wavered. They grew old side by side, their hair turning to silver, their faces etched with the lines of a life well lived, but their love never once faded. They still sat together on the porch most evenings, watching the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, holding hands and talking about whatever the day had brought. In the summer of 1925, they celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The old ranch house was just filled to the brim with laughter and love. And as Zelda looked around at the beautiful family they had made together, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for that strange twist of fate that had brought James Quinn into her life on a hot August day back in 1889. "What is on your mind?" Quinn asked her quietly, coming to stand beside her in the kitchen doorway as she watched their family enjoying themselves in the yard. "I was just thinking about that contract," Zelda said as she wrapped her arm around his waist. "About how my entire life changed in an instant because you stopped my hand and read those words to me. Everything I have, everything we have built together, it all started right there in that moment." Quinn leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "I thank God every single day that I happened to walk into that land office right when I did. You are the greatest blessing of my life, Zelda." "You always have been." "And you are mine," she answered, reaching up to kiss him. "My cowboy, my love, my home." As the sun went down on that perfect summer evening, turning the big sky all shades of orange and red, Quinn and Zelda stood side by side, looking out at everything they had built. They had 3 children, all grown into fine adults, grandchildren who understood the value of hard work and doing right, and even great-grandchildren who were the promise of the future. The ranch that Marcus Emerson had started with his bare hands, the one he meant as a gift for his niece, had turned into the heart of a family legacy. The land rolled out as far as the eye could see, well cared for and loved, a living story of what a person can do with a vision and a will to see it through. But more than all the land, or the cattle, or the money they had made, the most important thing was the love that grew from one simple, kind act. It all started when Quinn stopped her hand from signing that paper, when he read the words to her and offered help when she was all alone. That one moment of kindness had bloomed into a love story that their family would tell for many, many years. When the sky turned dark and the stars started to light up the huge Oklahoma night, Quinn and Zelda walked slowly back toward the house, their hands held together just as they had been for 36 years. Tomorrow would have its own troubles and its own blessings, and new reasons to be thankful. But for tonight, they had all they could ever need: each other, their family, their land, and a love that had shown time and again it was strong enough to get through any storm. Zelda let her mind wander back to that scared young woman in the land office who couldn't read a word and was about to sign away her entire future. She wished she could go back in time and tell that girl not to worry, to let her know that things were going to work out better than she could ever dream. That the tall cowboy with eyes the color of a stormy sky, the one who stopped her hand, would end up being the love of her life, her partner, her whole world. But then again, maybe that young woman already knew in a way. Maybe in that 1 second when Quinn's hand covered hers and kept her from making a terrible mistake, she felt the start of something special. Maybe she saw her entire future right there in his kind eyes and heard it in his gentle voice. Long after their life together had settled, an older Zelda would sit and fill the pages of her journal, writing all about that one fateful day. Her hand, though weathered by time, was as steady as ever, forming each letter with a practiced grace. She wrote about being scared and about finding your courage. She wrote about how knowing how to read could open up the whole world while not knowing could leave you in the dark. She wrote about how a single moment of goodness could set a person's entire life on a better path. But more than anything, she wrote about love. Not the kind you see in pictures or hear about in songs, but the real, quiet kind. The kind that is built on the daily choice to stand by someone, to champion their hopes, and to help them become the very best person they can be. Quinn had done that for her, and she had done the exact same for him. Together, they had built a beautiful life that was made to last. Their story grew into something of a legend around Muskogee. Folks would tell the tale of the city girl who came out west and became a true rancher. They talked about the cowboy who taught her to read and then took her as his wife, and about the family they raised on a bedrock of hard work and love. The story got a little taller with each telling over the years, but the heart of it always stayed true. In the spring of 1935, James Quinn passed on in his sleep, as peaceful as a Sunday morning, at the age of 76. He had lived a good, long life, and had seen Oklahoma grow from a rough-and-tumble territory into a modern state. He had watched his children and their children put down roots and prosper. Zelda was right there beside him when he took his last breath, holding the same hand she had held thousands of times over their 46 years. "I will love you forever," she whispered, as his eyes finally closed. "Thank you for stopping my hand that day. Thank you for absolutely everything." The funeral brought out hundreds of people from all over the state. Quinn was a man respected and loved by everyone who knew him, a man whose word was his bond and whose honor was never in doubt. They laid him to rest on the hill next to Charlie Watson, with a view of the land he had loved and worked his entire life. Zelda lived for 10 more years after Quinn passed, with her family all around her still running the ranch with the help of her children. She never even thought about marrying again. James Quinn had been the great love of her life, her one and only, and she was happy to spend the rest of her days carrying his memory in her heart, with her until they could be reunited. In her final years, she dedicated herself to writing down the family's story. She recorded every memory she could hold on to, making absolutely sure that the folks who came after would know their roots and understand the sacrifices made for them. She wrote about her Uncle Marcus and his big dream of giving her a better life. She wrote about Charlie Watson and his unwavering loyalty. She wrote about the neighbors who had made her feel at home and the tough times they had all weathered together. But the tale she told the most, the one that never got old, was about the day a cowboy put his hand over hers, read a piece of paper out loud, and saved her from ruin, setting her off on a path she never could have dreamed of. Zelda Emerson. Quinn passed on peacefully in her sleep on a warm October night in 1945, at the age of 81. She died in the very bed she had shared with Quinn for more than 40 years, in the house they had packed full of love and laughter. Her children discovered her that morning with a calm smile on her face, her hand resting on Quinn's pillow, as if she was reaching for him one last time. They laid her to rest next to Quinn on the little hill. And on her headstone they carved the words from a love letter Quinn had sent her when they were courting, words she had held dear her entire life. You are my heart, my home, my forever love. The ranch was passed down through the family from one generation to the next. Each new owner added their own page to the story, but they never once forgot the foundation, that single moment when everything turned. It was the moment a cowboy saw a lady in a tight spot and decided to step in, and by doing so, he found his own true path. Many years later, historians looking into how the Oklahoma Territory was settled would sometimes find mentions of James and Zelda Quinn. They would read about the prosperous ranch, the family that helped build up the whole community, and the woman who taught herself to read and became one of the most successful businesswomen around. But what those dusty old records could never show was the warmth in Quinn's smile when he looked at his wife, or the way Zelda's eyes would just light up the moment he walked into a room. They couldn't capture the strength of a bond built on deep respect and steady support, or the true depth of a love that had passed every single test and only got stronger as the years went by. When it was all said and done, what really mattered wasn't the number of acres or the heads of cattle or the money they had made. What mattered was that on a scorching August day in 1889, two souls found each other at the perfect time. One was in desperate need of help and was brave enough to take it. The other saw that need and had a heart big enough to meet it. And from that one simple act, a love story began that would last long after they were both gone. It would teach their descendants to always believe in the power of kindness, the value of learning, and the life-changing magic of a true and honest love. The contract that Zelda had almost put her name on, the very one that would have stolen her inheritance, was eventually put in a frame and hung up in the ranch house as a permanent reminder. Underneath it, Zelda had written in her own clear hand, "The most important paper I never signed, the day my real life began." And every single member of the Quinn family who looked at that old yellow document knew the truth of it. Sometimes the very worst thing you think can happen is just the door opening to the very best thing. Sometimes being stopped right at the finish line isn't a failure but a rescue. And sometimes, the person who pulls you back from the edge of disaster becomes the one person you can't imagine a single day without. The story of Zelda and Quinn became the bedrock of the family. It was told and told again at every gathering, getting a little bigger with each telling, but never once losing its simple truth. It was a constant reminder that love can show up where you least expect it, that a single moment of courage or a simple act of kindness can change a whole lifetime, and that the strongest partnerships are built on a whole lot of trust, respect, and the shared will to help each other be better than they ever could be on their own. As the years rolled by and the world changed in ways Zelda and Quinn couldn't have fathomed, their great-great-grandchildren would still meet on that hill overlooking the ranch. They would still tell the story of the cowboy and the girl from the city, and they would still shake their heads in wonder at how one single choice, one hand reaching out to stop another, could send ripples down through all those years. The land that Marcus Emerson had fought so hard to get for his niece was still in the family. The house that James Quinn had built with his own two hands was still standing, updated a bit here and there, but at its heart, it was still the same. And on those quiet evenings, when the wind would sweep across the Oklahoma prairie and the setting sun would paint the whole sky gold and red, those who remembered would swear they could still feel the two people who started it all right there with them. Two people who met by pure chance but stayed together by choice. Two people who built a beautiful life from the ashes of what they had lost and the promise of what could be. Two people whose story was living proof that love, the real kind, was something worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth building an entire life around. Zelda Emerson had shown up in Oklahoma territory with nothing to her name but a carpet bag and a hope, unable to read a single word, vulnerable, and all alone. She left this world having created a legacy of knowledge, prosperity, and love that reached hundreds of people and continued to shape her family for years to come. James Quinn had been a quiet cowboy with a fine ranch, but not a soul to share it with, right up until the day he stepped into a land office and saw a woman in trouble. He made the choice to help, and in doing that, he found the part of his own heart that had been missing. Together, they showed the world that the best love stories aren't about being perfect. They are about two imperfect people who just refuse to ever give up on one another. They are about making the choice to be with each other every single day, through all the hard times and the good ones, through all the heartaches and the celebrations. They are about building something side by side that is bigger and better than either of them could have ever been alone. And the whole beautiful story started simply because a cowboy stopped a woman's hand and read a contract out loud, changing both of their lives in that one moment, forever. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.